Alright, let's get into it. Number 10. Publius Quinctilius Varus and the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. In the autumn of 9 AD, 3 Roman legions marched into the Germanic forests east of the Rhine River under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus, a man of considerable political standing and absolute confidence in the loyalty of his guide. The forest was dense, the track narrow, and the sky above the canopy barely visible. Varus had been warned. A chieftain named Segestes had come to him days before, insisting that the man leading the column into those trees was a traitor. Varus dismissed the warning entirely. He trusted his guide completely, and that trust was about to cost Rome 20,000 lives. The man Varus trusted was Arminius, a Germanic chieftain who had served in the Roman auxiliary forces, earned Roman citizenship, and been trained in Roman military tactics at Rome's own expense. He had dined with Varus, he had advised him on Germanic affairs, he had cultivated that relationship with a specific and devastating purpose. As Varus's column stretched across miles of muddy track through the Teutoburg Forest, Arminius rode away to join the warriors waiting in the trees. The trap had been years in the making. The legions, formed for open battle on wide plains, were about to be obliterated in terrain that neutralized everything they knew. Rome in 9 AD was the supreme military power in the known world. The legions, specifically the 17th, 18th, and 19th, represented centuries of tactical refinement, institutional discipline, and battlefield dominance. Varus had served as governor of Syria and had successfully managed difficult provinces before. His appointment to Germania was a mark of imperial confidence. Emperor Augustus expected him to continue the process of Romanizing the Germanic territories east of the Rhine, turning them into a productive province as Gaul had become before it. The strategy was working, and Varus had every reason to believe the process was nearly complete. What Varus failed to understand, and what Arminius understood with lethal precision, was that Roman military supremacy depended entirely on open ground. In a field, a Roman legion was effectively unbeatable. In a forest, compressed into a column miles long, flanked by ravines, unable to form its characteristic battle formations, it was simply a mass of men waiting to be killed from the sides and rear simultaneously. Varus had received intelligence suggesting a local revolt required his attention, which was itself a fabrication designed by Arminius to draw the legions off the open road and into the trees. He marched his men into the trap without hesitation. The attack came from all sides at once over 3 days beginning in late September. Germanic warriors who had concealed themselves throughout the forest fell on the Roman column before it could form any defensive position. The soldiers could not see their attackers clearly, could not use their javelins effectively in the compressed terrain, and could not maneuver their units into the formations that would have given them any fighting chance. Rain made the ground treacherous and their shields heavier. The column fractured into isolated segments, each overwhelmed separately. Roman officers attempted to restore order, but were cut down before any coherent response could be mounted. The catastrophe was total and irreversible within hours. By the third day, all 3 legions had been effectively destroyed. Approximately 20,000 Roman soldiers were dead, with estimates from scholars, including classicist Adrian Murdoch, ranging as high as 25,000 when auxiliary troops are included. Officers who survived the initial attacks were captured and ritually sacrificed. The standards of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions were taken, a humiliation of the deepest possible magnitude in Roman military culture. Varus himself, surrounded and knowing what captivity would mean, fell on his own sword. The Germanic tribes mutilated his body, and his head was eventually sent to Augustus in Rome. The emperor's reaction, recorded by the historian Suetonius roughly a century later, became one of history's most famous expressions of military grief. Augustus reportedly wandered his palace for months, refusing to cut his hair or beard, and was heard crying repeatedly into the walls, "Varus, give me back my legions." Whether those precise words were spoken or represent a later tradition, the strategic reality they expressed was brutally accurate. Rome never fully recovered its grip east of the Rhine. The frontier established after Teutoburg essentially held for the remainder of the empire's existence, meaning one 3-day massacre in a German forest reshaped European geography permanently. Archaeological excavations at Carrhae, a site in Lower Saxony identified from 1987 onward by researcher Tony Klun and subsequently confirmed by German authorities as the likely battle location, have recovered Roman military equipment, coins, and skeletal remains consistent with the ancient accounts. The site shows evidence of a column under attack from elevated positions, with artifacts concentrated in patterns suggesting panicked retreat rather than organized resistance. The physical evidence confirms what the literary sources described. 3 legions were annihilated not by a superior enemy force, but by a single man's catastrophic failure to question what he was being told. The numbers retired from service after Teutoburg were 17, 18, and 19. Rome had roughly 30 legions at any given time, and those 3 numbers were never reassigned. They simply disappeared from the imperial order of battle, a silence that spoke to the depth of the wound. Future commanders studied Teutoburg as the paradigmatic example of what happens when a general's confidence in his own judgment overrides the intelligence available to him. The forest had done nothing wrong. The Germanic warriors had done exactly what warriors in forests will always do. Varus had brought them the opportunity, wrapped in 3 legions. Arminius was eventually killed by members of his own family in approximately 21 AD, never having unified the Germanic tribes into the lasting power he might have created. His victory was tactical rather than civilizational, but Varus's defeat was both. The decision to trust one man absolutely, to dismiss the warnings of another, and to march 20,000 soldiers into terrain for which they were entirely unsuited was not the decision of a fool. It was the decision of a man so certain of his own reading of the situation that contradictory evidence simply failed to register. In command, that particular form of certainty has always been more dangerous than any forest. Number 9. Arthur Percival and the Fall of Singapore. On the morning of February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Ernest Percival walked toward the Ford Motor Factory at Bukit Timah carrying a white flag and a Union Jack. He was bringing with him the surrender of more than 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian soldiers to a Japanese force that was, by almost every material measure, in no position to demand it. The Japanese commander, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, had fewer than 30,000 troops, was critically short of artillery shells, and had told his staff privately that he was not certain his lines could hold if the British pushed back with any determination. They did not push back. Percival surrendered. Winston Churchill, writing in his memoir The Hinge of Fate, published in 1951, described the fall of Singapore as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. That verdict has never seriously been challenged. The fortress island of Singapore had been presented to the British public and the empire as an impregnable bastion, the cornerstone of British power in Asia, a position so formidable that no enemy could take it by force. That reputation was built on genuine defensive infrastructure, including massive naval guns facing the sea. What it conspicuously lacked was any serious fortification facing the jungle to the north, and that was where the Japanese came from. The failure to defend the northern approaches to Singapore was not an oversight that occurred in the chaos of wartime. It was a deliberate peacetime decision made by Percival himself in 1940 and 1941, when he served as a senior planner and later as the commander of Malaya Command. Military engineers had requested permission to construct fixed defensive positions along the northern shore of Singapore Island and through the jungle of southern Malaya. Percival refused. His stated reasoning, documented in British War Office files, now held at the National Archives in Kew, was that constructing visible defenses would damage civilian morale and signal a lack of confidence in the broader Malayan defensive plan. The broader plan depended on stopping the Japanese advance far to the north, in northern Malaya and Thailand, before it could reach Singapore. When that plan collapsed within weeks of the Japanese landing in December 1941, driven by General Yamashita's rapid advance down the Malayan Peninsula, using a combination of bicycle infantry and audacious flanking movements, Percival found himself defending an island with no northern defenses against an enemy he had never expected to reach the island's shore. The very fortifications he had refused to build were now the only things that might have saved his army. They did not exist. By February 8, 1942, Japanese forces had crossed the Johor Strait onto Singapore Island itself. Percival's force still numbered well over 80,000 men, substantially outnumbering the attackers. The Japanese were moving so quickly and aggressively, however, that the psychological momentum was entirely theirs. British and Commonwealth units had been retreating for 2 months. Percival's command communications were fragmented, his officers uncertain, and his own assessments repeatedly misjudged the Japanese strength and intentions. On February 11th, he reported to London that the situation was grave but not yet critical. The situation was critical. Yamashita, for his part, was bluffing on a scale that bordered on reckless. His artillery had approximately 100 shells per gun remaining by February 14th. His supply lines across the Johor Strait were dangerously exposed. His troops were exhausted from the pace of their own advance. In the post-war interrogations conducted by Allied investigators in 1945 and 1946, Yamashita confirmed that a determined British counterattack during the final days before the surrender would have faced a Japanese force in serious difficulty. He had gambled that Percival would not find out. He was right. On February 15th, Percival convened a meeting with his senior commanders at the Fort Canning bunker complex in Singapore. He presented two options: a counterattack at dawn to attempt to retake the reservoirs and food depots the Japanese had seized, or surrender. His commanders, including Lieutenant General Gordon Bennett of the Australian Imperial Force, were divided. The water situation in the city was genuinely critical, with civilian casualties mounting from Japanese shelling. Percival chose surrender. He cited the risk of further civilian casualties, the water shortage, and the state of his troops. He did not know that the man across the table from him was nearly out of ammunition. The consequences were staggering and immediate. More than 80,000 soldiers entered Japanese captivity. Many were sent to work as forced labor on the Burma-Thailand Railway, where approximately 12,000 Commonwealth prisoners died from disease, starvation, and brutality. The prisoners who entered Changi prison and the labor camps faced conditions that shattered thousands of men who had survived the fighting without serious injury. The surrender that Percival calculated would limit civilian suffering instead created years of military suffering on a scale that the battle itself, had it continued, might never have matched. Number 8. Alexander Samsonov and the Battle of Tannenberg. In the last days of August 1914, General Alexander Vasilievich Samsonov commanded the Russian Second Army from a position so remote from his fighting units that he could not reliably communicate with them. His staff had inadequate maps of the East Prussian terrain through which his soldiers were advancing. His supply lines had been stretched beyond any reasonable operational limit by the speed of the advance his superiors in Petrograd were demanding. And every order he issued, every position report his corps commanders sent him, every request for reinforcement or instruction he transmitted to the army group was being broadcast by radio in plain, unencoded text. The Germans were listening to all of it. The Battle of Tannenberg, fought between August 26 and 30, 1914, near the town of the same name in what is now northeastern Poland, resulted in the near-total destruction of a Russian army of between 150,000 and 190,000 men. Approximately 78,000 were killed or wounded. A further 92,000 were taken prisoner, a figure that represents one of the largest single captures of the First World War's opening months. Two German commanders, General Paul von Hindenburg and his Chief of Staff General Erich Ludendorff, orchestrated the encirclement. They did so with remarkable speed and confidence, and their confidence was grounded in something extraordinary. They knew exactly where every Russian unit was. Russia entered the First World War as the largest military power in Europe by manpower, commanding an army that would eventually mobilize millions of soldiers across a front stretching thousands of kilometers. In August 1914, however, the Russian military machine was operating under enormous pressure from its French allies to attack immediately, before the full mobilization that would take months to complete. France, facing the full weight of the German army in the west following the Schlieffen Plan's opening offensive, desperately needed Russia to draw German forces eastward. Grand Duke Nicholas, commanding Russian forces, relayed that pressure directly downward through his army commanders, and Samsonov found himself ordered to advance faster than his logistics could support. The strategic concept was straightforward and, on paper, reasonable. The Russian First Army under General Paul von Rennenkampf would advance from the northeast, the Second Army under Samsonov from the south, and together they would encircle the German Eighth Army in East Prussia between them. It was a classic double envelopment, the kind of maneuver that had destroyed armies throughout military history. The problem was coordination. Rennenkampf and Samsonov reportedly despised each other personally, an enmity rooted in a confrontation on a railway platform during the Russo-Japanese War a decade earlier. Communication between the two armies was poor and deteriorating as the advance proceeded. The fatal decisions Samsonov made were several, but the most catastrophic was one he may not have recognized as a decision at all. His army lacked the trained radio operators and the cryptographic materials to encode its transmissions properly. Rather than delay communications until encoding was possible, his staff transmitted in clear text. German signals intelligence units intercepted every message. When Samsonov ordered his flanking corps to advance, the Germans knew. When his central corps reported its position, the Germans knew. When Samsonov's own headquarters moved, the Germans knew that too. Hindenburg and Ludendorff were able to redeploy their forces by rail with a precision that seemed almost supernatural to the Russians who survived, because they were working from a complete picture of the Russian disposition, while Samsonov worked from fragments and guesswork. The encirclement closed around the Russian Second Army's central core with devastating speed. German forces swung from both flanks simultaneously, cutting off the line of retreat southward, while pinning the Russians from the front. The fighting was intense, and the Russian soldiers, many of them well-trained professionals rather than raw conscripts, fought hard in circumstances that offered them no realistic hope. Units that attempted to break through the encircling forces were destroyed piecemeal. By August 29th, Samsonov's central force was surrounded, out of ammunition in many sectors, and cut off from any possibility of relief. His flanking corps had been driven back and could not reach him. The casualty figures from Tannenberg shocked Europe. The 92,000 prisoners taken represented more men than many national armies of the era could put into the field. The German government displayed the captured standards of destroyed Russian regiments publicly, and photographs of long columns of Russian prisoners were distributed widely as evidence of a victory so complete it seemed almost impossible. Hindenburg became a national hero in Germany virtually overnight, his reputation built on a battle he had won primarily because his enemy had told him everything he needed to know. The German General Staff studied the role of signals intelligence at Tannenberg for the remainder of the war. Samsonov himself did not survive to face the inquiry that would certainly have followed his defeat. On the evening of August 29th, as his army collapsed around him, he walked away from his staff into the forest with several officers, telling them he could not bear to survive such a catastrophe. Gunfire was heard. His body was found by his staff in the darkness. The manner of his death, his disappearance into the trees of a collapsing front, followed by a single shot, carried a terrible symmetry with the fate of his army, swallowed by terrain and circumstances it never understood. His widow was later permitted by the Germans to recover his body. Number 7. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. On the afternoon of April 24, 1836, the most powerful military commander in North America ordered his army to rest. His soldiers set up camp in a low meadow beside the San Jacinto River in what is now eastern Texas, stacked their arms, and many of them lay down to sleep in the warm afternoon air. No defensive perimeter was established. No sentries were posted on the approaches to the camp. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, president of Mexico and commander of its army, was confident that Sam Houston's Texian rebel force was beaten, demoralized, and incapable of offensive action. He was wrong about all of it. What happened next took 18 minutes. Sam Houston's army of approximately 900 men advanced across open ground using a low ridge to screen their approach, reached the edge of the Mexican camp before a single alarm was raised, and then struck with concentrated fury while a fife and drum played a song called "Will You Come to the Bower?" The Mexicans, many of them still half asleep, had no time to form any coherent defense. The fighting lasted less than the time it takes to brew a pot of coffee. When it was over, approximately 630 Mexican soldiers were dead and 730 more were prisoners. Texian casualties totaled 9 killed and 30 wounded. Santa Anna himself was found the following day, hiding in tall grass, dressed in the uniform of a common soldier. To understand the full magnitude of what Santa Anna lost at San Jacinto, it is necessary to understand what he had accomplished in the weeks before it. In late February and early March of 1836, he had besieged and then stormed the Alamo Mission in San Antonio, killing all of its approximately 189 defenders after a 13-day siege. At Goliad on March 27th, he had ordered the execution of approximately 342 Texian prisoners of war who had surrendered under terms, an act that sent shockwaves through the Anglo-American settler communities of Texas and the United States. These were not the actions of a man who doubted his own military supremacy. Santa Anna had divided his forces during the pursuit of Houston's retreating army, a decision that multiple Mexican officers had advised against in writing. He had approximately 1,300 men at the San Jacinto camp, with reinforcements under General Martin Perfecto de Cos arriving on the morning of April 21st to bring the total to roughly 1,400. He knew Houston was in the area. His own cavalry had skirmished with Texian scouts on April 20th, the day before the battle, and both sides had exchanged cannon fire at distance. The battle had been telegraphed. Santa Anna chose to rest anyway, apparently believing that Houston would not dare attack a numerically superior professional army. What made the decision not to post sentries so catastrophic was its completeness. This was not a case of inadequate security, a few guards falling asleep, or pickets failing to hear an approaching enemy. There were no pickets. Santa Anna had given no order establishing any defensive perimeter of any kind around his camp. A marshy lake sat on one flank and the river on another, which he may have considered adequate natural protection, but the landward approach across the open meadow was entirely unguarded. Houston's men walked, and in some accounts ran, to within musket range of the Mexican encampment before anyone in the camp was aware they were there. The element of surprise was not achieved through brilliant deception. It was handed to Houston as a gift. The 18-minute battle produced a casualty ratio that military historians still describe as among the most lopsided in North American history. Of the roughly 1,400 Mexican soldiers at San Jacinto, more than 90% were killed, wounded, or captured in less than half an hour. Houston's force suffered fewer than 40 total casualties. The disproportion was not the result of superior Texian marksmanship or tactics. It was the result of an enemy that could not respond coherently because it had made no preparations for the possibility of attack. An army with no sentries is not an army, it is a target. Santa Anna's capture the following day added a dimension of almost theatrical humiliation to an already devastating defeat. He had removed his elaborate general's uniform and dressed himself in the blue smock and leather cap of a common cavalry soldier. He might have escaped detection entirely, except that as he was brought into the Texian camp, other Mexican prisoners began calling out El Presidente in recognition. The man who had ordered the execution of hundreds of prisoners at Goliad was now a prisoner himself, identified by the very men he commanded. Sam Houston, wounded in the ankle during the battle, received him lying against a tree. Under the pressure of captivity and the threat that his enraged captors might execute him in retaliation for Goliad, Santa Anna signed the treaties of Velasco on May 14, 1836, recognizing Texas as an independent republic and agreeing to withdraw Mexican forces south of the Rio Grande. The treaties were later repudiated by the Mexican government, which refused to accept terms extracted under duress, but the military reality they reflected was permanent. Mexico's ability to reconquer Texas depended on its army, and at San Jacinto, Santa Anna had effectively destroyed the most capable portion of that army through simple negligence. Number 6. Luigi Cadorna and the 11 Battles of the Isonzo. Between June 23, 1915 and September 12, 1917, General Luigi Cadorna, Chief of Staff of the Italian Army, ordered his forces to attack across the Isonzo River 11 times. He attacked in summer and in winter with a heavy artillery preparation and without it, against the same Austrian positions on the same elevated karst plateau above the same river in what is now the border region between northeastern Italy and modern Slovenia. The attacks failed 11 times. The terrain favored the defender at every point. The Austrian positions, blasted from the limestone rock of the Carso Plateau, were among the most formidable fixed defenses on any front of the First World War. Cadorna ordered the 12th attack before he was finally removed from command. The cumulative human cost of the 11 Isonzo battles represents one of the most devastating tallies of command failure in the history of modern warfare. Italian military records, compiled in the official war histories published by the Comando Supremo in the decades following the armistice, document approximately 300,000 killed, 500,000 wounded, and 300,000 captured or missing across the 11 battles, totaling more than 1 million Italian casualties. These losses occurred against an Austro-Hungarian force that, for most of the Isonzo campaign, was defending with fewer troops than the Italians were attacking with. The mathematics of the disaster were available to Cadorna throughout. He did not alter his approach. Italy entered the First World War in May 1915 on the side of the Entente, having negotiated the Treaty of London, which promised significant territorial gains, including Trieste, the Istrian coast, and portions of Dalmatia. The Isonzo River was the logical axis of advance toward these objectives, and Cadorna's initial plan to cross it and drive through to Trieste was not, in its broad outlines, strategically unsound. The problem was tactical. The Austro-Hungarian defenders had used the months between the outbreak of war in 1914 and Italy's entry in May 1915 to prepare exceptionally strong defensive positions in the limestone hills above the river. They had tunneled into the rock, constructed interlocking fields of fire, and positioned their artillery on reverse slopes that protected it from Italian counter-battery fire. Cadorna himself was not an unintelligent man. He had studied military history extensively and wrote competently on operational theory. What he lacked, and what the Isonzo campaign exposed with brutal clarity, was any capacity for tactical adaptation in response to failure. His operational concept remained essentially unchanged across 11 battles, a heavy artillery bombardment followed by infantry assault against prepared positions uphill across open ground. Each time this produced enormous casualties and negligible territorial gain, Cadorna attributed the failure not to the tactical concept, but to the fighting quality of his soldiers and the competence of his subordinate commanders. His solution to failure was to replace the men failing, not the method producing the failures. The most disturbing dimension of Cadorna's command was his response to units he deemed insufficiently aggressive in their attacks. He revived a disciplinary practice that military historians describe using the Roman term decimation. Italian parliamentary records and military archives document cases where Cadorna ordered that soldiers be selected by lot from units he considered to have retreated without sufficient cause and executed. The men selected died not because they had committed any individual act of cowardice or disobedience, but because they belonged to a unit their commander had judged collectively inadequate. Officers who protested this practice were relieved. The practice continued. Soldiers who survived one attack on the Carso were sometimes shot for surviving it. John Keegan, in the First World War, published in 1998, identifies Cadorna's character as one of the most problematic of any senior commander of the conflict, notable even in a war that produced an extraordinary concentration of catastrophically poor generalship. Cadorna's refusal to visit the front lines, documented by multiple contemporaries including his own staff officers, meant that his understanding of conditions on the Carso was entirely theoretical. He planned attacks on positions he had never seen from positions his men actually held. The maps his headquarters worked from consistently understated the difficulties of the terrain. When his infantry reported that conditions were impassable, he attributed it to a failure of will rather than a failure of geography. The 11th Battle of the Isonzo, fought between August 17 and September 12, 1917, produced Italian territorial gains that were the largest of the entire campaign, including the capture of the town of Gorizia's surrounding heights. It also produced 300,000 casualties in 25 days. Cadorna celebrated it as a vindication of his methods. He was already planning the 12th attack when the Austro-Hungarian and German high commands launched Operation Caporetto on October 24, 1917, striking the Italian line at its weakest point with a combined force employing the infiltration tactics that had been refined on the Eastern Front. The Italian line collapsed catastrophically in hours. Number 5. George Armstrong Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. On the morning of June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer halted his Crow and Arikara scouts on a ridgeline in the Wolf Mountains of the Montana Territory and looked into the valley of the Little Bighorn River below. His scouts had already warned him. The pony herd grazing near the river was the largest any of them had ever seen, a fact that experienced plainsmen understood immediately as an indicator of an encampment of extraordinary size. Scout Bloody Knife, who had served with Custer for years, reportedly told him through an interpreter that there were more Lakota warriors in that valley than the 7th Cavalry had bullets for. Custer thanked him and ordered the attack. The battle that followed, known to history as Custer's Last Stand and to the Lakota as the Battle of the Greasy Grass, lasted approximately 2 hours on June 25th and into June 26th, 1876. Of the roughly 210 men Custer led directly into contact with the main Lakota and Cheyenne encampment, not one survived. The total 7th Cavalry killed across all 3 columns, including those in Troy-Niemauves under Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, came to approximately 268 men. Against them, Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, numbering somewhere between 1,500 and more than 2,000, had gathered in the largest concentration of Allied Plains Indian fighting men ever assembled in the Northern Territories. Custer divided his regiment in their faces. Custer came to the Little Bighorn carrying a reputation built on Civil War aggression that had made him the youngest major general in Union Army history at 23. His bravery was genuine, and his tactical instincts in open cavalry engagements had served him well in battles including Yellow Tavern and Appomattox. But his career also carried a court-martial in 1867 for abandoning his command without authorization to visit his wife and a suspension from rank for 1 year. He returned to favor through political connections and the patronage of General Philip Sheridan. By the summer of 1876, he was operating under pressure, aware that his political protector Ulysses Grant had recently become his enemy, and reportedly harboring ambitions toward a Democratic presidential nomination. The plan devised by Brigadier General Alfred Terry assigned the 7th Cavalry the task of approaching the suspected Lakota encampment from the south, while Terry's own column and Colonel John Gibbon's infantry approached from the north, creating a coordinated encirclement that would prevent escape. Terry's orders to Custer, issued on June 22nd, gave him discretion in timing, but specifically asked him to coordinate with the other columns. Custer moved faster than instructed, made contact with the village on June 25th, one day earlier than Terry had planned for, and then divided his regiment into 4 separate elements without any means of rapid communication between them. He did this knowing, from his scouts, that the village was enormous. The specific tactical decision that sealed the regiment's fate was Custer's division of his available forces into 3 attacking columns in the immediate presence of an enemy whose size he had been warned about but chosen to disbelieve. He sent Reno to attack the southern end of the village with approximately 140 men. He sent Benteen with approximately 125 men on a scouting sweep to the south that effectively removed them from the battle's opening phase. He kept approximately 210 men under his own command for what he apparently intended to be a strike on the northern end of the village. When Reno's attack collapsed almost immediately under pressure from thousands of warriors, the 3 columns were too far apart to support each other. The archaeological survey of the Little Bighorn battlefield, conducted from 1983 onward by a team led by archaeologist Richard Fox and documented in his 1993 work, Archaeology, History, and Custer's Last Battle, overturned the popular image of Custer's men making a disciplined last stand on the hill that now bears their names. The distribution of cartridge cases and human remains across the battlefield tells a different story. Custer's force fragmented under pressure, with different companies becoming separated and destroyed sequentially, rather than fighting as a coherent unit. The physical evidence shows movement patterns consistent with attempted retreat rather than a defensive perimeter. The men died running, not standing. What the cartridge patterns also revealed was the overwhelming disproportion of firepower that the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors brought to the fight. Many of the warriors were armed with Winchester repeating rifles, capable of firing multiple rounds without reloading, while a significant portion of the 7th Cavalry carried Springfield Model 1873 single-shot carbines. The Springfield was accurate at range, but slow to reload, and in the chaotic close quarters fighting of the final stages, this disparity was decisive. Custer's command had been outgunned as well as outnumbered, a fact that his own procurement decisions favoring the Springfield over the Winchester, despite contrary recommendations, had helped to create. Number 4. Douglas Haig and the First Day of the Somme. At 7:28 in the morning on July 1st, 1916, British officers along a 15-mile stretch of the Somme River Valley in northern France blew their whistles simultaneously. Approximately 120,000 British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began walking across no man's land toward the German positions. A week-long artillery bombardment, the largest the British Army had ever fired, had been intended to cut the German wire, destroy the German forward trenches, and kill or stun the German soldiers who had been sheltering from it. The wire was largely uncut, the forward trenches had been rebuilt, and the German soldiers, having spent the bombardment in dugouts as deep as 12 meters underground, emerged when the barrage lifted and manned their machine guns before most of the attacking infantry had crossed 100 yards. By the time darkness fell on July 1st, 1916, the British Army had suffered 57,470 casualties. 19,240 men were dead, 35,493 were wounded, 2,152 were missing or captured. It remains, more than a century later, the single most catastrophic day in British military history. The losses fell disproportionately on units of the PALS battalions, formations recruited from the same towns, factories, and sports clubs, meaning that entire communities learned within days that they had lost an entire generation of young men simultaneously. The scale of the grief was matched only by the scale of the tactical failure that produced it. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force in December 1915, replacing Sir John French following a series of operational disappointments. Haig was a cavalry officer by background and training, a graduate of Sandhurst and Oxford's Brasenose College, and a man whose self-confidence was of the kind that does not readily admit external information that contradicts its own assessments. He had served in the Sudan under Kitchener and in the Boer War, and his career had been one of steady advancement within an institution that rewarded certainty and discouraged doubt. He came to the Somme believing that a sufficient concentration of artillery and infantry could break any defensive line, given enough shells and enough men. The preliminary bombardment that preceded the July 1st attack fired approximately 1,500,000 shells along the British sector of the front over 7 days. An expenditure of material that strained the entire British industrial and logistics apparatus. It was genuinely the most intense artillery preparation in the history of British warfare to that point. The problem, understood by German engineers and apparently not adequately credited by Haig and his 4th Army Commander General Sir Henry Rawlinson, was that the German defensive system had been designed specifically to survive exactly this kind of bombardment. The deep dugouts, some constructed to 12 meters or more below ground level by German pioneer troops using industrial techniques, rendered the shelling essentially harmless to the soldiers sheltering inside them. When the barrage lifted to allow the infantry to advance, the Germans simply came back up. The specific order that turned a tactical disadvantage into catastrophe was the instruction that British infantry cross no man's land in extended lines at walking pace. The rationale was that running men would disorder their formations and arrive at the German trenches in a disorganized mass, while walking men would maintain their alignment and arrive ready to exploit whatever the bombardment had achieved. This reasoning assumed the bombardment had achieved something. It had not achieved the destruction of the German defenders, and walking men in extended lines were the ideal target for machine gunners emerging from underground shelters. The German Maxim gun teams had been trained for exactly this scenario. They performed their function with mechanical efficiency. The regimental records of the units that attacked on July 1st, now held in the National Archives at Kew, document losses that in some cases reached 90% of attacking strength within the first hour. The Accrington Pals, formerly the 11th Battalion of the East Lancashire Regiment, suffered 585 casualties from approximately 700 men in the first 20 minutes of the attack. The Newfoundland Regiment lost over 700 men of approximately 800 who went over the top, achieving nothing. The Sheffield City Battalion lost 513 men. These were not isolated disasters. They were replicated across the entire front in unit after unit through the entire morning. Haig's diary entry for the evening of July 8, 1916, preserved in the papers of Field Marshal Earl Haig, held at the National Library of Scotland, records his assessment of the day. He described the results as very satisfactory, considering the objectives had not been achieved, attributing the difficulties to the performance of certain divisions rather than to the fundamental failure of his operational plan. He was not dissembling for his diary. The available evidence from his private papers and correspondence strongly suggests that he genuinely believed the day had been broadly acceptable. His disconnect from the reality experienced by his soldiers was not cynical. It was architectural, built into the physical and psychological distance between army headquarters and the front line. Number 3. Friedrich Paulus and the Encirclement at Stalingrad. On the morning of November 23, 1942, the last road connecting the German 6th Army to the rest of Army Group B was cut by advancing Soviet armored columns. Operation Uranus, launched 4 days earlier on November 19th, had driven through the Romanian flanks of the German position north and south of Stalingrad simultaneously, and the two Soviet pincers had now linked at the town of Kalak on the Don River. Approximately 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were now inside a Soviet encirclement ring roughly 50 kilometers across. Among them was General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the 6th Army, a meticulous staff officer and loyal subordinate who had been given the largest and most powerful army in the Wehrmacht and was now watching it begin to die. He had a window in which he might have broken out. He chose to ask for permission instead. The encirclement of the 6th Army at Stalingrad, between November 1942 and January 1943, produced one of the most consequential military disasters in the history of the Second World War. Of the approximately 300,000 soldiers encircled, around 91,000, including 24 generals and Paulus himself, entered Soviet captivity after the surrender on January 31st, 1943. Of those 91,000 prisoners, fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany, most not until the early 1950s. The remainder died of disease, starvation, and cold in Soviet prisoner of war camps. The German dead inside the pocket during the fighting, from combat, cold, starvation, and disease, numbered approximately 150,000 to 160,000, according to scholarly estimates, compiled by military historians including Antony Beevor in his 1998 work Stalingrad. The city on the Volga that bore Stalin's name had acquired a significance for both sides that went far beyond its industrial or strategic value, though those values were real. Hitler had publicly announced the city's imminent capture in a speech on September 30th, 1942, making any outcome short of conquest a personal humiliation. Stalin, for precisely symmetrical reasons, had refused to allow the city to fall, ordering a defense that bled both armies wide through the summer and autumn of 1942 in the kind of urban fighting for which German military doctrine was entirely unsuited. By November, the Sixth Army had fought its way to the banks of the Volga at extraordinary cost, holding approximately 90% of the city's rubble, while Soviet forces clung to a narrow strip along the western bank. Paulus had been aware for weeks before Operation Uranus of the dangerous weakness of the German flanks north and south of the city. The Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies holding those flanks were equipped with obsolete anti-tank weapons and lacked the armored reserves to respond to a major Soviet breakthrough. Paulus had raised these concerns with Army Group B Commander Field Marshal Maximilian von Weichs, who had raised them in turn with Hitler's headquarters at Wolfschanze. The concerns were acknowledged and disregarded. When the Soviet offensive opened on November 19th, the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad collapsed within hours, and the Sixth Army's supply lines became vulnerable within a day. In the critical period between November 23rd, when the encirclement was complete, and approximately December 12th, when Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, was halted 60 kilometers short of the pocket. A breakout attempt by the Sixth Army retained a realistic chance of success according to the subsequent analysis of military historians. The Sixth Army still had fuel for several days of mechanized movement. It still had operational armored units. The Soviet encirclement ring, while forming rapidly, had not yet been reinforced to the depth that would make penetration by a concentrated force impossible. Paulus knew all of this. His chief of staff, General Arthur Schmidt, reportedly argued for the breakout with particular urgency. The obstacle was Hitler's direct order, issued on November 24th, that the Sixth Army was to hold its current positions as a Festung, a fortress, to be supplied by air and relieved by a ground offensive that Hitler assured Paulus was being prepared. Paulus was constitutionally unsuited to the choice this created. He was a staff officer of the old school, precise, obedient, deeply respectful of the chain of command that had structured his entire professional life. To break out without explicit authorization from Hitler's headquarters would have required him to act in direct violation of a specific order from his supreme commander on the basis of his own military judgment that the order was wrong. He was not the kind of man who did that. He requested permission. The permission was denied. He obeyed. The Luftwaffe airlift that Hitler promised would sustain the Sixth Army through the winter proved catastrophically inadequate. Air Fleet 4 under Colonel General Wolfram von Richthofen calculated from the beginning that the required daily supply tonnage, estimated at between 500 and 700 tons per day, was impossible for available aircraft to deliver into the shrinking perimeter of airfields the Army controlled. The actual daily average delivered was approximately 100 tons, roughly one-fifth of the minimum required. Soldiers inside the pocket received steadily diminishing rations through December and into January. By the end, daily bread rations had fallen to 50 grams per man. Men began dying of starvation in one of history's most powerful armies. Manstein's relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, was launched on December 12, 1942, by the 4th Panzer Army. It achieved initial success, advancing to within approximately 60 kilometers of the pocket's southern perimeter before being halted by Soviet forces on December 23rd. At that point, Paulus still had the fuel and ammunition for a breakout attempt to meet the relief force, a maneuver that Manstein urged on him in barely coded communications. Paulus again requested Hitler's authorization to break out while holding a corridor open. Hitler again refused. Manstein's force was then diverted to meet Soviet threats elsewhere on the front. The last realistic opportunity to save the Sixth Army closed. Number 2. Lord Raglan and the charge of the Light Brigade. On the morning of October 25, 1854, Field Marshal Lord Fitzroy, James Henry Somerset Raglan, commander of the British forces in the Crimea, sat on horseback on the Sepune Heights above the North Valley near Balaclava, and watched Russian forces moving artillery along the causeway heights below him. Raglan could see from his elevated position that the Russians were attempting to remove British naval guns captured from the redoubts earlier that morning. He had already issued 3 orders that day attempting to stop them. None had produced the result he intended. Shortly before noon, he dictated a 4th order to his aide-de-camp, Captain Louis Nolan. The order was approximately 17 words long. Those 17 words have been analyzed by military historians for 170 years without producing complete consensus on exactly what Raglan meant by them. The order read, Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Raglan could see the guns he meant. From his position on the Sapounet Heights, the Causeway Heights redoubts were directly below him and slightly to his left, clearly visible, with Russian troops moving around them in an unmistakable way. The order was clear to him because he was looking at the situation from above. But the order was to be received by Lieutenant General the Earl of Lucan and executed by Major General the Earl of Cardigan, both of whom were positioned in the North Valley floor, where the Causeway Heights blocked their view of the Russian activity on the other side. They could not see what Raglan could see. Lord Raglan had served as military secretary to the Duke of Wellington through most of the Napoleonic Wars, and had been present at Waterloo, where he lost his right arm above the elbow. He had not commanded troops in the field in the intervening 40 years, a gap that his appointment to command the British Expeditionary Force to the Crimea in 1854 did not address. He was 65 years old, personally courageous, deeply courteous, and administratively capable in the peacetime traditions of the British Army. He was also a man who sometimes referred to the enemy in conversation as the French, the mental habit of a lifetime spent fighting Napoleon's armies, causing occasional alarm among the French allies now fighting beside his men. His staff worked around his idiosyncrasies. On October 25th, they could not. The Crimean War had been entered into by Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire in March 1854 to resist Russian expansion toward Constantinople and the Mediterranean. The British army that landed in Crimea was an institution that had not fought a major European war since Waterloo in 1815, nearly 4 decades earlier. Its officer class was dominated by men who had purchased their commissions, a system that prioritized wealth and social connection over demonstrated competence. Its logistics were managed by a commissariat system that proved catastrophically inadequate within weeks of the campaign's opening. By October 1854, the Allied forces were besieging their Russian naval base at Sevastopol and had already suffered severely from cholera. The cavalry, superbly equipped and largely idle, represented the one arm of the British force that had not yet been tested seriously. Captain Louis Nolan, who carried Raglan's 4th order down from the heights to Lucan in the valley, was himself a cavalry reformer and theorist, the author of a well-regarded 1851 work on cavalry tactics, and a man who regarded both Lucan and Cardigan with visible contempt for what he saw as their timidity in failing to employ the cavalry aggressively during previous engagements. When Lucan read the order and told Nolan he did not understand which guns were intended, Nolan's response was impatient and, according to multiple eyewitness accounts recorded in the immediate aftermath, accompanied by a gesture. Witnesses disagreed on exactly where Nolan gestured. Some said he pointed toward the Causeway Heights. Others said he pointed toward the far end of the North Valley, toward the main Russian battery with its dozens of guns and its supporting infantry and cavalry. Nolan was killed by a Russian artillery shell in the first minutes of the charge. His exact words and gesture died with him. Cardigan led the 673 men of the Light Brigade down the North Valley at approximately 11:20 in the morning of October 25, 1854. The valley was approximately 2 kilometers long and flanked on both sides by Russian artillery positions on the Fedyukin Heights to the left and the Causeway Heights to the right. The Russian battery at the far end of the valley had additional guns and infantry positioned behind it. The Light Brigade rode directly down the center of this killing ground at the trot and then the gallop, receiving fire from 3 directions simultaneously. French Marshal Pierre Bosquet, watching from the heights alongside Raglan, reportedly said, "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre." It is magnificent, but it is not war. He then added the phrase that has occasionally been dropped from the quotation, "C'est de la folie." It is madness. The charge lasted approximately 20 minutes. The Light Brigade reached the Russian battery at the far end of the valley, engaged the Russian gunners briefly, and then was driven back by Russian cavalry reserves. It retreated back down the same valley under the same flanking fire. When the survivors reformed, approximately 278 men were dead, wounded, or captured. Of the original 673, approximately 118 were confirmed killed and a further 160 wounded, many seriously. Cardigan, who had led from the front and reached the guns before his horse carried him back, survived unscathed. He reported to Raglan's position on the heights and told him the charge had been made under a most unfortunate order. Raglan replied that Lucan had lost the Light Brigade. Number 1, Marcus Licinius Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae. In the spring of 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome and a member of the ruling First Triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey, led 7 Roman legions across the Euphrates River into the Parthian Empire. He was 60 years old. He had no significant independent military command experience. He had refused the advice of the Armenian king Artavasi II, who had offered him a mountainous northern route into Parthia, sheltered from cavalry, with 40,000 allied troops included. He had chosen instead to march his army across the flat, open, waterless Syrian desert, following the guidance of a local chieftain named Ariamnes. Ariamnes was a Parthian agent. The flat desert was perfect terrain for the weapon that was about to destroy Crassus. He did not know he was being led into it because he had never thought to ask. The Battle of Carrhae, fought near the town of that name in what is now the Harran district of southeastern Turkey in June of 53 BC, resulted in the destruction of a Roman army that outnumbered its enemy by more than 3-1. Crassus commanded approximately 35,000 to 44,000 soldiers, the precise figure varying across the ancient sources including Plutarch's Life of Crassus and the histories of Cassius Dio. Against them, the Parthian general Surena, a commander in his late 20s known formally as the Spabad Rustahem Suren Palaf, fielded approximately 9,000 mounted archers and 1,000 heavily armored cavalry called cataphracts. Roman losses from the engagement and its immediate aftermath were approximately 20,000 killed and 10,000 taken prisoner. Surena lost fewer than 100 men. The ratio was so extreme that Roman writers struggled to explain it without acknowledging the catastrophic failure of leadership that produced it. Rome in 53 BC was an empire in the process of discovering the limits of its military system. The legions that had conquered Gaul and Spain and Greece and the eastern Mediterranean were the finest heavy infantry in the world, disciplined formations of armored men trained to fight in coordinated units with pilum and gladius on solid ground. That system had produced the most sustained record of military conquest in ancient history. What it had not been seriously tested against was an enemy that refused to engage it on those terms, that had no infantry to be defeated by the Roman legionaries' close quarters strengths, and that could maintain a continuous, withering fire from a distance greater than the range at which Roman weapons could respond. Surena had 10,000 such enemies. He also had something Rome's commanders had never encountered: a camel-mounted supply train carrying hundreds of thousands of arrows, allowing his archers to sustain their fire indefinitely without withdrawing to resupply. Crassus sought military glory for reasons that were entirely personal and nakedly political. He was one of the 3 most powerful men in the Roman Republic, the man whose wealth had bankrolled Pompey's armies and whose financial networks extended across the entire Mediterranean economy. But wealth was not glory. Caesar was conquering Gaul. Pompey had his eastern triumphs and his extraordinary reputation. Crassus had money and no victories. The Parthian campaign was designed to change that, to give him a military triumph comparable to his colleagues' achievements before the informal power-sharing arrangement of the triumvirate broke down entirely, as everyone understood it eventually must. He pursued it over the opposition of a tribune named Aetius Capito, who publicly cursed the expedition on religious grounds at the city gates, and multiple senior colleagues who questioned both the legality and the wisdom of attacking a nation with which Rome was formally at peace. The tactical situation at Carrhae developed in a way that was, according to subsequent military analysis, almost unavoidable given the terrain Ariamnes had led the Romans onto. Surena's mounted archers surrounded the Roman column in the open desert and began a sustained archery attack that the Romans could not effectively answer. The standard Roman response to archery was to advance rapidly and close to killing distance with their own weapons. When the legions advanced, the Parthian cavalry withdrew, maintaining their distance while continuing to fire. When the Romans halted and formed the testudo, the overlapping shield tortoise formation designed to deflect arrows, the archers simply waited for exhaustion and thirst to reduce the formation's cohesion before resuming. Crassus sent his son Publius with approximately 5,000 men to drive back the Parthian cavalry. Surena's archers drew this force away from the main body, surrounded it, and destroyed it almost entirely. Publius's head was brought back on a Parthian lance and displayed in front of the Roman line. The physical and psychological condition of the Roman army after Publius's death was, according to Plutarch, one of paralysis and despair. Crassus himself, by the accounts that survived, was barely coherent in his commands. The army managed to withdraw to the town of Carrhae during the night, a movement executed with such disorder that several thousand men, too wounded or too frightened to keep pace, were left behind in the desert and killed by Parthian pursuit cavalry the following morning. At Carrhae, Crassus received a message from the Parthian command suggesting a negotiation. His officers urged him to refuse. Several subordinates, including the general Cassius Longinus, the same man who would later be one of Caesar's assassins, advised immediate retreat northward toward Armenia. Crassus went to the negotiation. What happened at the negotiation is reported by Plutarch and Cassius Dio in accounts that differ in their details but agree on the outcome. Crassus was killed, almost certainly during a violent confrontation that erupted as the meeting began, possibly when he refused terms, possibly when Roman soldiers accompanying him fought with Parthian guards. Some ancient sources report that Surena, knowing of Crassus's notorious greed, arranged for molten gold to be poured into his mouth after death, though scholars including Adrian Goldsworthy have treated this detail as likely legendary rather than historical fact. What is certain is that Crassus died at the negotiation, that his head and hand were cut off and sent to the Parthian king Ordes II, and that they arrived during a performance of Euripides' Bacchae at the Parthian court, where an actor used the real head as a prop in the scene, calling for the severed head of Pentheus. History rarely produces coincidences that precise. The military consequences of Carrhae extended far beyond the loss of an army. The 7 legionary eagles captured by Surena's forces represented a humiliation of symbolic magnitude that haunted Rome for 3 decades. Eagles were not simply flags. They were the sacred objects around which a legion's identity and honor were organized, objects whose loss was treated as a catastrophe requiring religious as well as military response. Augustus Caesar eventually recovered 3 of the captured eagles through diplomatic negotiation with Parthia in 20 BC, an achievement he commemorated on coinage and in the famous marble breastplate statue now known as the Augustus of Prima Porta. That a negotiated diplomatic retrieval was celebrated as a major imperial achievement indicates how deeply Carrhae's wound had cut into Roman military pride. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.